if you agree. Thank you for coming to Bologna. And just to introduce the speakers, we have Italy here from University of Münster, Yuri from University of Moscow, Victor from Warsaw, Elena from Bologna, Jose from Lisbon, and Chiara Bonfiglioli will join us virtually in the afternoon because she couldn't be here today. Well, our intention, as you probably show here in the program, we also have another day tomorrow on the Italian Communist Party, and this will be in Italian, so you're not required to be there or allowed. And today we really wanted to have a real workshop, so the opportunity to discuss our research. And the reason why we organize these meetings are that the Gramsci Foundation has around 1,200 personal files of members of the Communist Party, mainly collected between 45 and 56. And within this file, which are mostly of militants who had attended the party school, there are every kind of personal materials, including the questionnaire and the autobiography, according to the Soviet model of the Ancheta, and the autobiographies that many communist leaders and militants had known during their stay in Russia in the years between the two wars. These materials have been increasingly used by the historiography, and I will quote here the first important book which extensively used these files, was published already in 2007 by Mauro Boarelli. And he carried out an in-depth and systematic analysis of these files. And Boarelli read these sources highlighting, on one side, the code imposed by the party in order to provide these militants with a language capable of forming a new self-awareness on one side. And on the other side, he also looked to the cultural background of these people, who were mainly peasants or working class people, and they also had their own language and self-representation. So he looked at the meeting and clash of these different cultural codes and the forms of adaptation. There are some common points between these Italian autobiographical practices and Soviet Russian. Firstly, I would say this normative framework within which these practices occur. These texts had to correspond to a normative code which influenced the language of this narrative, and we have to be aware of this in using these sources. The further common point is that these autobiographies were written, but also then socialized orally, discussed orally, in working groups, during which these speakers were questioned, sometimes with distrust. Their beliefs were explored, the past scrutinized, weaknesses and shortcomings sought. It was a painful and often psychological maritime exam. Moreover, the massive use of these autobiographies also responded to a practical problem. Immediately after the war, the membership of the Communist Party grew very rapidly within a country that had come from 20 years of fascism. In order to check the origin and the reliability of these new members. It was the autobiographies represented a control and selection tool. And the Russian Communist Party had the same problem in the early 20s, so also this practical aspect was shared by it. In Russia, in the 20s, these texts were written within the Komsomol, with the Svertlova University, or within the party, and then subsequently a collection of these dossier and autobiography was also developed within the Comintern. And so there was an internationalization of this practice. Students from America and Europe attending the Lenin School were asked to write autobiography, as well as African and Asian students attending the Communist University of Toilets of the East. The practice was then extended to the party schools in France, in Germany, already in the Euro period, and even during the Spanish Civil War. There was a fairly systematic collection of biographies of the members of the International. The foundation has tried to recover the personal files of the communists of our area at the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History. We collect some of these files, although in the last year it has become difficult because there are increasing limitations on the consultation. So, wonder why this would be very good. For instance, the latest we were able to recover in the last months concerns some Italians who participated to the Spanish Civil War. These were we were allowed to get that. Since the mid-90s, there has been a historiographical production that has used not only this material but also other sources of the South, so to say, in the Soviet Union in the 30s, such as letters and diaries, for a reconsideration of the nature of Stalin's totalitarianism. These studies have used in different ways and with varying degrees of appropriation the late Foucauldian reflections on the relationship between power, language, and subjectivity. Path-breaking book was that of Stephen Kotkin on Magnitogorsk, in which he analyzed the active participation in the construction of Stalinist subjectivity in the 30s. More than looking at power only as something that controls, limits, represses, aspects that Kotkin certainly recognized in the structuring of Stalin's power, but he also tried to illuminate the proactive side of the action of Stalin's power, how it tried to actively conform subjects to its own goals. It is a top-down movement, which, however, also requires a bottom-up mobilization and subjective involvement. To strengthen the foundation of Soviet power, it was necessary to provide a language through which to formulate one's subjectivity, the meanings of one's existence in a way which overcomes purely imposition. That is, to spread a way of expressing and thinking about oneself in a coherent and constructive way consistent with the building of socialism. Kotkin analyzed this process, however, in a way in which the coercive aspects of a regime prevailed and the subjects somehow negotiated their autobiographical representations, reacting to these requirements coming from above. Not conforming to this entailed personal costs, even simply in material terms, that is, with job opportunities, income, but also higher personal risks, censorship, and language. In a long review of Kotkin's volume, Igor Alfil and Joachim Halbeck while recognizing the back-breaking value of Kotkin's work, advanced some criticism. One of which I think opened up a new line of research that these two authors developed over years. I would formulate it with a question. Did this mediation between the aims of the regime and the subjected individuals remain at the level of negotiation, with the subjects reacting somehow to this imposition? Is it not possible that this restructuring of the self to which these subjects were pushed was genuinely successful? In other words, that they, or at least part of them, were convincingly committed to conform themselves to those requests, and that even in their personal crisis, rather than manifesting dissent, this personal crisis derived from self-criticism for not being up to the task, or at least not yet up to the historical task with which they were invested. The following is, I told you this, the research of these two authors was directed precisely toward this aim, and they use extensively these autobiography sources. So I took this quotation of an essay on Delbeck because I think it summarized the point I was trying to do, in which he wrote both of these dimensions of biography, so one side the shaping effects of state power and the individual appropriation and signification on the other. Together they cast light on the Soviet communist century as a distinctly biographical age. In describing themselves into the communist drama of human struggle and salvation, individuals could claim for themselves the roles of active participants in the world historic stage. Well, this debate, and so here I just quote some of the words, then both Helbeck and Eva Harkin also published essays and collective volumes. I also quote Brigitte Studer and Bertolt Amtsbriege's Vernichtes Parteikadern because it was also important in this historiographical climate. And I think that these debates and researches marked a turning point and a notable methodological innovation. And this is the reason why I recall them, although we will focus today on other dimensions, which I will summarize. I think that they are important because they hold an important position in the intellectual genealogy of biographical approaches to the study of subjectivity in Soviet communist history. In the wake of these new approaches, the investigation of autobiographical practices in the history of communism also internationalized following the Comintern role in spreading them globally, but also looking at national adaptation and the diffusion of such practices. I'm thinking of the research again of Brigitte Studer, but also Penetier and Poudal in the French case, Boaderdi for the Italian one. But now we have also essays concerning autobiographical practices of Chinese, communist, American, Spanish, and so on. On the basis of this historiographical work, it seemed useful to me to focus our workshop around three questions that allow us to broaden the field in which to reconsider these sources. The first is chronological, concern periodization. i.e., looking at the entire 20th century, which will allow us to question the origins of these practices and their possible connection with non-communist autobiographical practices, as well as to try to understand how these practices have changed or have even abandoned in the course of the 20th century. If we look at our collection, for instance, at the Gramsci Foundation, we can see how we have some autobiographical texts in the 30s, and these were people staying abroad in Soviet Union or in the Spanish Civil War. And then we have the massive production of this text between 45 and 56. And then this practice was abandoned, actually. We don't have later. This is not the case of other Western European countries. For instance, in France, as far as I know, they went on also in the 60s. And then Yuri showed how this autobiographical production was massive in the Soviet Union after the Second World War, while the historiography worked mainly on the period between. This is another interesting point. The second aspect is a geographical one. From a geographical point of view, we'll have tomorrow a day specifically devoted to the Italian experience, but today we will look at the Russian, of course, and Soviet experience, which certainly represented a fundamental point of reference also for this. We will also look at the Polish experience before and after, I think, the transition to socialism. And then we will refer also to extra-European contexts in which the reflection on the self inevitably differed because communist autobiographies were hybridized by other matrices of autobiographical narratives, and the communist political experience combined with other political instances like anti-racism, anti-fascism, and the politics of development. The last but not least, the methodological point. Some of these autobiographies were somehow forced, so people were required. And they were written within a regulatory framework where there is an explicit and binding request from a state, from an institution, from a party to write up your own autobiography, and this is then subjected to critical examination. And this, we have to read these sources keeping in mind that there is this regulatory framework and this imposition. Other biographies are spontaneous, I would say, in the sense that they are not solicited by anyone. However, they too can depend on a more or less conscious normative pattern of reference. In short, using these sources, we are called to reflect on their peculiar nature and to have philological and interpretative care. I hope that this variety of tests that we presented and analyzed today can also serve to focus on these methodological aspects and to give us insights in approaching these services. Thank you.
Observations on the continuities between militancy in the revolutionary autobiographical accounts in the late Tsarist Empire and militancy in the communist autobiographies of the Stalin era. I use the term autobiographical accounts because I don't want to limit myself strictly to autobiographies. I will be talking about letters, diaries, all sorts of things that help to shape self-understanding or shape the self. Best known Soviet diaries and memoirs belong probably to members of the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia. Lydia Tchaikovskaya autobiographical notes on Anna Akhmatova, the dark prose of Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs, or Lydia Ginsburg's notebooks from the 20s and 30s have attracted much attention. Another well-known example is the diary of Nina Lyugovskaya. She belonged to another generation. She was actually a schoolgirl when she wrote a diary in 32 to 37, but her father was a former Central Committee member of the Party of the Left Socialist Revolutionaries. In her diary, she denounced the lies of the dictator, scoundrel and dog, quote, Stalin. She even dreamed of killing him. Of course, people like Lugaskaya were not able to express their frustration and anger publicly. As the editors of the diaries of the poet Mikhail Kuzmin once remarked, the Stalin era was an epoch in which papers, manuscripts and documents began to play an immeasurably greater role in people's lives than before, and often became legal evidence. However, as Paolo showed, a significant number of autobiographical texts challenged the common image of a silent, atomized society. The declared goal of the Bolsheviks' multifaceted propaganda campaigns was to create a new revolutionary consciousness. The individual had to be able to consciously identify with the revolution, learn to recognize himself or herself as an active participant of the drama of history, and build a new, better world out of his free revolutionary consciousness. Diaries and autobiographies, according to Jochen Hellbeck and others, often served as tools for internalizing revolutionary values. They were important aids in creating the new Soviet man. The function of autobiography, as you have showed, changed already in the 20s. They were now used in everyday life. For example, they were written to achieve the status of party candidates, in joining the Komsomol, non-party institution, and so on. So they were control and selection tools. The reference to the revolution, according to Hellbeck, usually had two sides. The individual made the revolution and was made by the revolution. This double theme was especially popular with people who had to live with the stigma of being born with the wrong social backgrounds. Hellbeck Stepan Padlubny, for example, longed for self-transformation and self-improvement through collective work. Even forced labor could be celebrated as a form of self-liberation. The revolutionary self was therefore an ideological project of self-perfection and self-transformation into a vicious political subject. So you would not know who this man is. It's Nikolai Kozhevin, and I have analyzed his autobiography as a student. Kozhevin was a staunch communist living in the Komi Republic. He had internalized the idea of cleansing the social organism of harmful elements, and he had internalized that this was important and good for Soviet society. If you're wondering how I got this autobiography, well, I had to marry his granddaughter to get access to the archive. Kozhevin came from a peasant background. His father and brother were killed by the whites during the Civil War when Kozhevin was a child. This made him a natural Bolshevik sympathizer. He changed several professions, including working as a secretary in the OGPU and as a secretary of a party cell. After a probation period of almost 2 years, his membership in the party was finally confirmed in 1928. His greatest achievement was to become the director of a machine tractor station in the kolkhoz. But it's also a story of a radical who, as a child, participated in the murder of class enemies. His autobiography lists dozens names of people he considered to be traitors and enemies of the people. Just one quote from his autobiography: "When cattle are slaughtered, I sometimes feel compassion, but when these bastards were killed," he's speaking about Kulak hostages from his village, "I wanted to participate in the killing myself." Unfortunately for Kozhevin, however, he was arrested and died in prison in 1937, probably because of torture. So while we can consider this to be an expression of communist militancy, the author, I'm not talking about the actual man Kozhevin, but more about the way of his self-fashioning. The author is subordinating his own life to a higher idea, to communism. Marriage, for example, is mentioned in his autobiography only in half a paragraph. while a lot of space is given to his devotion to the communist cause. Experiences of violence serve as justification for the use of violence against class enemies. We can't talk about a spiral of violence here. The enemy is everywhere. It can be your neighbor, your co-worker, anybody. So the big question here is, can we observe something similar in the autobiographies of the Tsarist era? Well, yes and no. First of all, we have to keep in mind that there was a rich autobiographical culture in Russia. We have autobiographical accounts stemming from different parts of society, of course including workers and peasants. If we are looking specifically for socialist or proto-socialist autobiographies, we have to go back to the reign of Nicholas I and Alexander II, when the so-called oppositional autobiography developed. It is sometimes understood as a space in which criticism of the existing order was practiced. The most important sources of inspiration for later revolutionaries were the memoirs of the Decembrists and Herzen's Beloya in Dume. According to Herzen, the usefulness of memoirs lay in bringing the hidden, such as crimes committed by the police, into the light of day and making them known to the whole world. Oppositional militancy, however, developed later in the 1860s. A good example is the well-known pamphlet written by the student Piotr Zechnevsky. In Young Russia, he wrote that the country was entering the revolutionary phase of its existence. The contradictions between the lower and upper classes were no longer tolerable. They could be eliminated only by a bloody and merciless revolution. This would destroy the foundation of the old order and wipe out its supporters. A river of blood would flow, but the revolution would justify everything. These were fantasies of a young man, of course, and most radicals did not speak publicly of the necessity of killing all enemies of the revolution. When a series of terrorist attacks were carried out in the late 70s and early 80s, revolutionary terrorists were rather reluctant to speak of their victims. Instead, they preferred to focus on themselves and to portray themselves as martyrs and heroes. Autobiographical accounts would thus become an integral part of the communication strategy. Terrorists, or rather people accused of being terrorists, began writing farewell letters as they awaited for execution, for example. In these letters, they sometimes recounted their own lives and talked about their moral convictions. In many of these texts, the private and the political was closely intertwined. The authors claimed that they had not lived their lives in vain and that they had found a good death in fulfillment of their political duty. Some of the murderers of Alexander II, the so-called Permamatovцы, also narrated their lives in court. The revolutionary and journalist Vladimir Burtsev was particularly important for the dissemination of radical autobiographies. He was a staunch advocate of terrorist violence. In his numerous publications, for example in the well-known Beloya, he published texts that fitted perfectly into the terrorist narrative. Thus, images of unbending fighters for freedom were disseminated. People who calmly and steadfastly went to the scaffold and not only killed the enemy but died themselves as heroes and martyrs. The autobiographies of former Schlüsselburg prisoners were also quite popular. Of course, not all of them advocated violence and many appeared legally. The journal Beloya had its own section called From the Schlüsselburg Martyrology. It contained documents related to the lives of Schlüsselburg prisoners as well as memoirs. During and after the revolution of 1905, the letters and poems of Ivan Kalaev, it's an example I want to share with you. The murderer of the Grand Duke was widely distributed by the Socialist Revolutionary Party. They also contained autobiographical passages. Kalaev portrayed himself as a worthy revolutionary and successor of the Narodovoldцы. He claimed to have done his duty and to have found happiness in the assassination of the Grand Duke. Among other things, he wrote, "You know my convictions and the strength of my feelings, and so let no one grieve over my death. I gave myself completely to the struggle for the freedom of the working people. So let my death also crown my cause with the purity of the idea. To die for one's convictions is to beat the drum of battle, and whatever sacrifices the liquidation of autocracy may cost, I am firmly convinced that our generation will settle accounts with it forever. That will be the great triumph of socialism, when the whiteness of the new life will open before the Russian people, as well as before all those who feels the great burden of Tsarist violence upon them. As in the case of the farewell letters from the 70s and 80s, Kalaev considered death on the scaffold to be valuable and admirable. It was no coincidence that he raved about his party as the bearer of the commandments of the Narodная Voля. Here too, his own death was declared to be the culmination of a good life for the cause. Like the Narodovolci, he proclaimed his certainty that the triumph of socialism was near. He urged his comrades to instrumentalize his approaching death. As a political subject, Kalaev thus declared his own body to be a tool of historical progress, with the help of which political goals could be advanced. But at the same time, the political was private and the private was political. In other words, to live a good and happy life, to have friends and meaningful relations, meant to live for the revolution. This, of course, bore a strong resemblance with some autobiographies of the latest Soviet era. It resembles, for example, the ideals that structure Nikolai Kazhevin's autobiographical narrative. So if we compare these two, we will find, of course, a lot of differences. First of all, okay, they have something in common. Their names start with K. But Kalaev, they had a different social background, of course. They had different language. Kalaev read modernist poets, for example. He had much wider tool of self-expression than Kazhevin, who, for example, mixed Russian with Komi in his autobiography. But there is also something in common between them. The individual had to be able to consciously identify the revolution, learn to recognize himself as an active participant of the drama of history, and build a new, better world out of his free revolutionary will. But don't forget, we are talking about very specific contexts of terrorist violence on the one hand, and a context of competition and selection on the other hand. So we have always to keep the context in mind when we're comparing these very different, but maybe not so different sources. Well, how did this translate into latest Soviet practices? Here things become rather complicated. The reception history of revolutionary accounts is still understudied. Yulia Safronova is working in this direction, but still there is much to be done. But we know for sure that revolutionary propaganda was widely read. We know that many contemporaries did have an idealized and romanticized understanding of what a proper revolutionary should look like. And this influenced later ideas of what a revolutionary looks like. After the revolution, the Society of Former Forced Laborers and Exiles and its publication journal Katarga i Ссылка, which existed until 1935, published radical memoirs and autobiographical accounts. And there were, of course, state-sponsored publications about the glorious revolutionary past of the Bolshevik Party. Another important factor were films about brave and selfless Bolsheviks. But, as we have seen, the revolutionary self-fashioning had a much longer history, and at its core was the idea of subordinating one's own life or self to the primacy of revolution. Biographical and autobiographical accounts were important parts of a communicative process, especially when terrorist violence had to be promoted. Autobiographical accounts had to be authentic, not in the modern sense, of course, but as a mode of self-fashioning one's own life ought to be lived honestly. This was a quite often used word. Искренность, and in accordance with one's own deep inner desires and needs for justice and freedom. Autobiographical accounts were written by autonomous individuals who set life goals independent of church and state authorities. This was also important, however. In Western European philosophy, the ideal of autonomy is closely linked to the ethical reflections. It is not enough to set and pursue goals autonomously. It is also important to align one's own action with universal ethical standards. According to the philosopher Nikolai Plotnikov from Bochum, it is precisely this line of thought that was weakly developed in Russia. And yes, we will find virtually no serious ethical reflections in the autobiographical accounts text of Russian terrorists and their supporters, and we will find no ethical reflection in the autobiography of Nikolai Plotnikov. Thank you very much.
For me to be here today, and I have to thank the organizers of this event and the Antonia Gramsci Foundation who made this possible. There are several reasons for. Is there a presentation?
Yes. L'avevamo scaricato.
Non mi ricordo se l'avevamo fatto.
Forse maybe still here.
Oh, it's
No,
not.
just give me 1 minute and.
So, but I will proceed.
No, but you,
Uh-huh.
we have time.
So, I have several reasons for my special feelings today, and but I will briefly
Sorry.
mention only one of them. Actually, I know Antonio Gramsci's work.
What is the name of your presentation Bologna?
This one?
Exactly. Perfect. So this is about, here is the proof. You see 3 volumes of Antonio Gramsci's works in Russian translation that were published in 1950s. And in early 1970s, I bought it in my native city, provincial city of Taganrog, in a bookstore, in a used bookstore. And so since that time, I remember him as a very special political theorist and writer. At that time, as now I understand, what attracted me to his works, the language, his thought-provoking style that was completely different from Marxism I was taught in the USSR. So I feel that my being here today is not just a coincidence, but so in my talk I will review some general remarks on the topic of our event and my presentation. Actually, these reflections come from my previous research, also from my personal experience as a kind of a dinosaur who lived through a few decades in the Soviet epoch. So I will start with at the beginning. Okay, we don't need this side. You
want to go?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay.
So, I would like to start with terminology. And actually, today, the most often word that was labeled to the different text was autobiography. But I will start with the statement that there are autobiographies and there are autobiographies. So it's important for us to distinguish this while speaking about texts. We have to try to be as precise, specific as possible. So what I mean, by autobiographical narratives, I mean a wide-ranging group of texts in which individuals talk about their lives and themselves. Literary critics usually label these texts following the genre structure of modern European literature, most often as autobiographies, diaries, and memoirs. Historians generally tend to follow these labels, though several decades ago they noticed the existence of numerous personal texts, often composed by the ordinary people, which are substantially different from their literary genres. This discovery pushed historians to invent new designations. The most common among them are ego documents, self-testimonies, and life writing. In the further discussion, I will use autobiographical narrative as the umbrella term for all mentioned above. So the rise of the interest in autobiographical narratives among historians dates back to the late 1990s. At the time, new research topic came into being, now known as the studies of Soviet subjectivity. Its appearance was announced by Erich Neumann in 2001. I like the title of his article because it reminds me that the Soviet subject we strive to reconstruct as an objective reality is something made by us and not the reality itself. Still, the best study on Soviet subjectivity, in my view, is the painstaking reading of Russian communist diaries by Joachim Helbig. Though this book is remarkable in many aspects, I would refer here to only one. Maybe the most important from a theoretical perspective. Helbig claims that we should not approach communist autobiographical texts from the standpoint of an abstract present-day liberal subject who cherishes privacy and individual autonomy. To understand these texts as personal testaments, and historians deal with people, so it is worth viewing their authors as participants in dramatic political and social transformations that were taking place in the USSR after the October Revolution. Speaking about Soviet autobiographical narratives available to historians, it is worth starting with the reference of their enormousness. The Soviet period of Russian history left us millions and millions of texts in which people in this or that way told their life. Many thousands of these texts, generally of literary value, have been published. For the most part, they belong to Soviet writers, people of art, scientists, and other notable personality. There is little doubt that these published texts are only the tip of the iceberg, and that most of the life stories written by Soviet intellectuals still rest in the archives. As one might guess, autobiographical narratives of the ordinary Soviet people appeared in print only sporadically. Most of them, until recently, were kept in family and state archives, being hardly available for scholars. This situation has changed dramatically in the last decades, and now many thousands of these texts are easily accessible in electronic format on different internet platforms. Probably the most noteworthy among these platforms is the Open Internet Archive brochure. This is Google translation. Of course, nowadays you can listen to language. So what is important here? This center creates digital archive of personal documented from private collections. Just people submit their texts of their relative ancestors, and there is a group of volunteers who digitize them, and maybe if anybody is interested, it's easily accessible, project.org, and then it is searchable. I think it's a treasure for historians looking at Soviet autobiographical narrative. Some of these stories are also published at the University Publishing House in book form, just mostly ordinary people. Once again, I don't make a distinction between communists and non-communists, because communists are not a special breed. You see, it's teachers, I don't know, university students. Among my fellow students was one communist. I mean, he had communist ID, but actually anti-communist. Communist. So this distinction is not so clear, only formal in the late Soviet period, but if we have time, I will say a few words. So further, I will draw your attention to one particular type of Soviet autobiographical narrative. I don't know what kind of life stories of Italian communists are stored here in the archives, but I may suggest that they're similar to the type I will discuss. State and ministerial archives of the Russian Federation hold millions of documents that bear the same title of autobiography, which means exactly. These autobiographies were an obligatory part of the processing of documents in most institutions, organizations, and enterprises, so they can be accurately grouped together under the term bureaucratic or file autobiography. It's my invention. File autobiography derived from the term file self, which was used in historiography by Schiller Fitzpatrick first, but I decided to make a distinction to demonstrate how that this is a special autobiography. started using this file autobiography. In contrast to the established literary genre of autobiography, these texts are usually short, from 1 to 3 pages, factually based, and similar in their narrative structure. Descriptions of emotional experiences, reflections, and doubts on the basis of which we could on the basis of which we could speak about the personalities of their authors are generally lacking. An important distinguishing feature of these autobiographies is that people wrote them due to external necessity, namely the requirements of Soviet documentation project. However, to a large extent, similarities with literary autobiography are also glaring. In both cases, we are dealing with chronologically organized retrospective accounts of an individual about his or her life journey, written from the first person singular, which include the details of their origins, studies, work, family, and other traditional autobiographical topics. My reading this type of documents rests upon the following general premises. First, authors compose these texts not for us, in order to tell us about their lives, but for state efficiency, in order to present themselves before the state in a particular way, in a bad. Second, in each case, the composition was an act that was carried out in concrete socio-political circumstances, which were different. Early decades of Soviet history, the late decades, once again, this is another story. Third, these circumstances to a significant degree shape the structure and content of the narrative. Four, the act of composing file autobiographies functions as a mechanism through which the state exercised control over the individual. I like this photo taken in 1957 by an American photographer in Moscow. Why? Sorry. Okay.
There's someone that...
There are not voices from Moscow. 58, no.
Did you say something Russian?
No. That's why I'm saying that it's not the soundtrack to the photo.
Just this picture. I want to demonstrate that.
Okay, no.
Almost
Because
all
there is another person who entered, so... Okay, but now it's... Okay.
I wanted to show this. Almost all these people, on different occasions, composed their file autobiographies. Just to give you an idea of how enormous these, not all of them, of course, survived through. And this is another story, how files of Soviet employees are preserved, but I will not go into the details, but these are the people, communists, non-communists, it doesn't matter in this. Now here is the example of one autobiography written by a 54-year-old worker of higher education institution, Alexander Petrovich Zbitnik. So from 1950s onward, file autobiographies were written virtually by every adult citizen of the USSR, sometimes on a repeated occasion. Upon starting a new job, receiving work attestation, joining the Communist Party, filing criminal cases, being presented with a state award, filling in documents for next visa to travel abroad, and so forth. According to their structure, these texts are remarkably alike. The main data that Soviet people wrote about themselves were family name, patronymic, place and date of birth, social origin, education, career, party status, police file, social work, government awards, and family members. Differences in their narratives mostly relate to the degree of detail. If, for example, the author was a scientist, writer, composer, or state official, then he or she would report on their career path with much more details. In other cases, differences are minimal. The organization of the autobiographical narrative remains particularly the same. So, just a few words about this particular autobiography. As with all texts of this type, it begins with the date of birth and social origin, then provides information about the author's educational background, finally turning to the main part that describes his professional activity. After 2 years of compulsory military service, the Great Patriotic War began, and Alexander Petrovich was sent to the front, where he served in various divisions of the Soviet Army. After demobilization, a new period of his work history began as a Komsomol and Soviet functionary in Cameroon. Then the text reveals another career shift from Soviet official to library director and then professor in the local Institute of Higher Technology. After this, Alexander Petrovich mentioned that he became a member of the Communist Party in March 1946, and for participation in battles received 2 awards and 5 medals. Finally, the text once again refers to his current academic accomplishments and informs about his participation in public activity. At the end of the document appear the date and personal signature, as in all examples of this kind of autobiography. My familiarity with numerous personal files from the late 1940s to the 1980s does not leave any doubt regarding the direct connection between the file autobiography and the questionnaire. Another important document stored in the individual's person. Questionnaires structured the autobiographical narrative and to a significant degree determined its content. After providing the truth about oneself in the form of answers to questions asked by the state, individuals should come clean with it themselves, let's say, in their own voice and from the first person. The most detailed questionnaire that I know dates from the second half of the 1930s, the time of mass repressions and show trials. This questionnaire was not used across the board, but only by those being accepted to a position as a middle or higher level official. It contained numerous questions, many of which resemble political accusations, like, only some of them. Were you previously a member of any other political parties? Of which precisely? Where, when, and reason for leaving? Then, did you belong to anti-party groups? Did you or your close relatives share the anti-party view? Then, were you subjected to party purges? What, when, by which organization, etc.? The later form of the questionnaire, known in the USSR from the end of the 1960s, clearly shows a shift in the interests of the state from the political to the professional sphere, and to life of an individual. Educational institutions attended, academic degrees, knowledge of foreign languages, scientific publications, and technological inventions. In this way, if in the 1930s the state was still concerned with the struggle with spies and classic enemies, during the phase of developed socialism, information about education, professional abilities, and social activity became more relevant in its size. In general, the narrations in file autobiographies follow the changes in the questionnaire outlined above. Thus, the text of the 1930s emphasized the changes and emphasize the class and ideological purity of their authors, and those of 1960s and later decade tell for the most part about their participation in building communism and about their professional qualifications. And an important, though brief remark. It does not follow from what was being said about the correlation between two kinds of documents. That write and file autobiographies should be conceived as a mechanical repetition of the answers already given in the questionnaires. The situation was more complicated. In the autobiographical account, there was great opportunity to portray oneself in the best light than in the questionnaire. To emphasize something, to skip over something, to leave out some questions from the enquete, or on the contrary, to add some additional details. In my earlier research, I used the published texts of Soviet physics, autobiographies of Soviet physics from, say, late 1940s to early 1980s. And I could compare their life path. All the details of their lives are well known in encyclopedias and so. And then I could compare what they tell about themselves and the factuality of their life. And it was very interesting how they tried to avoid some life paths, that just participation in the White Army or something like this. So writing file autobiography was also a personal act. So the situation was more complicated than just mechanical repetition of the answers. In the autobiographical account, there was great opportunity to show oneself in a better way. So this way, the practice of writing file autobiographies functioned as a specific tool through which power relations between the state and the individual were exercised. Together with many other discursive practices of different kinds, it operated as a particular mechanism of subjectification of the people aimed at making them Soviet. If I can, a few words from my personal experience. I remember decades ago when I first was actually appointed a teacher at a local school, and they had to fill in this autobiography. And it was something that I had a feeling that I'm addressing the state. I had to write the no corrections, and so truth, and only. Okay. So, in the final part of my, talk as about methodology, I think it's very important. The same as terminology, methodology is also important, though it's not an easy thing. In my reading autobiographical narratives, I'm largely indebted to the studies of Gabriele Yankee, who coined the conception of autobiography as social practice. She calls herself a historian of early modern Europe, and she is. And she primarily deals with German texts of this period, though her approach, I believe, may be effectively used in the study of other autobiographical narratives. Here are some of the publications in German. This is her PhD, then one in English and one in Russian. I'm proud to say she wrote this paper in English for us to translate it into Russian to make it easier for us to read Russian. And so, but she has published a lot. The key point of her approach is the deep contextualization of autobiographical narrative. Of course, we are all historians and say, we take into account the context. But what does it mean? What do we mean by context? So, as I already thought, there are autobiographies, and they're different depending on the context. So, Yankee starts from the presumption that these narratives were written not for us to reveal their author's selfhood, but for some other people and some other ends. Correspondingly, she insists, the context of present-day studies of autobiographical text must be distinctly separated from the context of their production and first perception. Moreover, this is their coming into being that must be placed at the center of our research. Thus, we should focus on the reconstruction of such subjects as authorial motivation, strategies of writing, expected audience, and uses of texts at the time when they were composed or shortly after. Contextualization of this type, Yankee argues, has great potential and may lead to new insights and questions in different fields of autobiographical study. I believe that this methodology may be also effectively applied for better understanding of different sorted autobiographical narratives and different people who produce them.
So I hope this presentation will help us to maybe find some middle ground, or maybe see in a more problematizing light certain features of autobiographical writing between the, let's say, Italian, for instance, context of the left-wing militants and the Soviet biography. Because I want to tell you about let's say, the case and the context, which is maybe a bit particular in respect to these quite usual East-West divide, so to speak, in this literature on autobiographical writings. And let's maybe get full screen. And this is even more visible because I started the research on these from a slightly different viewpoint. So what I was interested in was not at the beginning autobiographical writing on its own, but more the experience which was carried by this autobiographical writing. I was interested in the transformation of the political sphere and the political self included during the 1905 revolution in the Russian-controlled Kingdom of Poland. And that's why I started to gather various autobiographical testimonies at the beginning, looking at them more as means and not as topic, referring to the famous distinction of Ingeborg Helling regarding autobiographical let's say, usage of autobiography in sociology. And that's why certain elements are more visible, because I was more interested in working class autobiography and not necessarily socialist autobiography only. And these, in comparison with a particular, let's say, political geographical context and particular layering of time in this context, will elucidate some interesting elements, I think. So my sources were quite varied. These were not only file autobiographies referring to Yuri Zaretsky label. These were also published books which somehow covered the experience of 1905. These were dedicated journals published by different political milieus in different political contexts and time frames. This is here important. So these are not only publications published in state socialism after 1945, but as well dedicated journals published in the interwar period within the framework of, let's call it, bourgeois Polish state, which nonetheless was considered a state of their own by at least some of the former socialist militants who were of the more nationalist breed, if you like. And these were as well memoirs published, for instance, in Moscow by professionalized revolutionaries who embarked on the revolutionary way in 1917, already within the Soviet framework. And so on and so forth. So these configurations of politics and poetics of writing were here different. This is the cabinet where personal files of the former so-called United Polish Workers' Party after 45 were gathered, so this was the closest to these file autobiographies. But as well files gathered by various party committees, so not only in professional context, but more politicized one. And this variety of contexts sort of urged me to conceptualize layers of time which accumulate in biographical or autobiographical, in this case, writing. So on the left side, you can see a sort of a generic category, and on the right side, a possible let's say, fulfillment of this category or its realization. So, what I wanted to show in these studies which I did on these biographies, which some of you may know, this is not a new material. I switched topics, so I refer here to studies which were already published, basically. So there are different social backgrounds, and there are different contexts in which people get socialized politically for different political experiences, and within different memory cultures, sort of facilitating biographical process. As we know, it's not memory which is making autobiography, but the process of autobiographical storytelling which is making memory. And this biographical storytelling was embedded in different party cultures and in different time frames. Yeah? And so that's why these layers were, for me here, important, even if, of course, I'm dealing with a ready-made textual objectivization of this process, which is made retrospectively from a given point of time, be it interwar, militant memory culture, or official commemoration after 1945 within state socialism. Yeah? Which also leads us to the question how this layer of socialism refer to each other. Socialism, and this is very visible as well in the leaflets, socialism as a concept, from the very beginning, within this language circulation, maybe in other languages it would be slightly different, I think it's similar. Socialism is always invested with a double meaning. This is a movement you are participating in, and this is as well a state of society this movement is aiming at. And these two levels are always entangled and collide within autobiographical writing, and it gets even more interesting when former socialist militants, being members of the socialist movement, are writing from the point of view of socialism as a state of affairs, so to speak. It is real socialism, which is not always the exact socialist dreamland of these people. They have their issues, they are critical, but nonetheless they have to refer somehow to the process of bringing it into life, so to speak. So it's not the context of failed struggle, as for instance, I don't know, Alessandro Portelli was researching in the Italian context, but it's also not the let's say, fully controlled acceptance and endorsement of the ready-made social context, because these people were quite often from different branches of socialism than this one, which sort of controlled official reality after 45, and it was even more complicated because there was no single memory to refer to. So here you have a sort of a brief map of factional divisions in the Polish left-wing scene. As you can see, maybe the take-out message is that it was a messy landscape. So there was no single party, almost never. Yeah? There was highly fractured movement, divided according to national lines, the attitude towards national question, the strategy of building the movement, the attitude towards comrades in Russia, or later the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So even if, when the official party, let's say, supported by the Soviet context, already unified somehow this official context, there was no easy tradition to refer to. There is no 1917 in Poland. They had to construct, struggling for legitimacy, some sort of lines connecting them with the past. And these lines were not that easy. This was as well a very heterogeneous context and movement. For instance, internationalist, communist, weakened by the Stalinist purges in the 30s. Yeah, the first, let's say, layer was killed, basically, before the war. But these internationalist comrades, they had completely different vision of how to build this memory than more nationalistically oriented group, which took control after 1956. And that's why these lines were not that easy, which also opened the space to renegotiate this storytelling, because there were still pockets of alternative visions and traditions possible, referring to either Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, so the Internationalist Party, or the PPS one or the second branch, which was more nationalistically oriented, especially this, and so on and so forth. And this memory was as well fractured in time, because this is something which I found out later, studying the decade after the 1905 and sort of trying to explain why actually the revolutionary upheaval later was very weak, and why that many people accepted actually the parliamentary democracy of the bourgeois type in the 1918. And it appeared that actually the 1905, even if it was venerated in the interwar context quite broadly within different political milieus, both the internationalist left, who was taking up the baton and sort of trying to reinvigorate the revolutionary tradition and repeat it. But it was also venerated among the PPS as a sort of an event of fighting for socialist popular independence against the Tsarist oppression. So this nationalist element of fighting against the foreign oppression was combined with the socialist one, and this was an active memory. But in the interwar period, directly after 1905, there are very little direct references. People are not trying to emulate or repeat the revolution. This is a failed revolution, a sort of a traumatic event, and the memory is reinvented actively later. So moving forward, there are a couple of elements which are here important. Now I will focus on this most internationalist context, so the social democracy of the Kingdom of Poland in Lithuania, so the far left, cooperating with the Bolsheviks as well, occasionally, on the imperial scale, so to speak, and the part of the official memory after 1945, but by no means the singular one. This was a problematic tradition, internationalist, so to speak, solving the national question in a different way that the official Leninist option would have it. This is the party of Rosa Luxemburg, who was sort of exorcised as a critic of Lenin. So this tradition was as well very contested, also accused by the nationalist communists after 45 of being internationalist, Jewish, cosmopolitan, and so on and so forth, and actively pushed out from the, let's say, ruling elite, but nonetheless remained a powerful actor within these memory struggles. And there are a couple of elements which I found interesting as constructing a sort of a bridge or connection or a short circuit, if you like, between these layers referring to the experience of life somewhere in the past and the endorsement of the current state of affairs within state socialism. And there are several tropes which I found interesting here, which show us how, not only how politics is shaping the poetics of writing in the given moment, let's say 1955 or something, but as well how these experiences and accumulated ways of dealing with yourself facilitated coming of real socialism as a particular social formation in a particular form, which was, after all, not coming from Mars or even from Moscow, but it was made actively by living people having particular historical experiences and trying to make their own dreams and issues they were struggling for somehow relevant within this social context. There are a couple of these elements. This misery to welfare, as you have seen in this previous quote, is a very important trope. As banal as it is, it's as well not a sort of a self-evident. This claim to better life is as well a historically emerging trope, and this was present in very clearly already in the socialist discourse at the beginning, and later the legitimacy of the actual solutions was very heavily built on this experience. This is maybe the most obvious of these tropes, but nonetheless very important. The second one is definitely upward intellectual mobility possible through the movement, and interestingly enough, exploited and explored in this particular political milieu in the most intense way. So I gathered I think over 100 of these narratives from different political parties. So there are several elements which can be roughly assigned, maybe not statistically, but you can see that majority of these vivid, intellectually mobile people who actually continued a sort of a way of a man of letters, but as professional revolutionaries, they found safe haven in this party and not in other political milieux. Yeah, the others remained maybe more militants as well, embarking on military careers later, or for instance they remained workers, as the nationalist workers. They write as elderly people, as veterans of labor. But these people, they had a chance as workers to become professional revolutionaries and write from this sort of commitment and militancy, maintained till the very late days. Yeah? So they, for instance, continued to serve the socialist issue as socialist functionaries, building various, educational committees. One guy was a head of the sort of association of atheists and so on and so forth. And this is something which they as well very heavily exploit. So the socialist movement gave them the way to leave behind their sort of intellectual condition of a worker only. They moved on, embarked on this intellectual pursuit, and they continue it, seeing a realization of these pursuits in the socialist state, which heavily built its legitimacy, for instance, on fighting illiteracy, organizing reading courses, and offering sort of universal enlightenment for these working class clients of this state. And this was, in a way, a true and fulfilled promise, however, of course, heavily ideologized in content. And there is this trope of political initiation, and very nicely visible, I think, in some of the narratives here. It's maybe not that easily graspable in my clumsy translation, but this is a very interesting biography written in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, with heavily visible Russian language interference. So this person clearly lost, so his Polish was Russified because of not being active for several decades. It's written in the 30s, I think. And what is important is this, that he's referring to his own autobiography as a brochure. He's using the very same word which was used to name these printouts which were given out to the workers by the socialist movement, and very often were the first written text they were exposed to, and the very first form of, let's say, broader story about the world around them. And in this case, it clearly started to be a sort of a paradigm of a written text as such. He is not using any other active vocabulary referring to his autobiographical writing. He is naming the written text a brochure, because this was the way he sort of embarked on the way of reading, which is, I think, quite important. And this actual sort of gift which socialism as well gave, offering this sort of network of concepts to tell the story about the world around in a more abstract term than direct, let's say, everyday issues, is as well a very visible thing these people are referring to while explaining their own socialist identity afterwards. This is how the leaflet looked like, which was exactly this career of the first socialist message. And this was the materiality of this. Yeah, like this was distributed, this was commented, read aloud in factories by those who could read around 1905, and till the very late it remained this paradigm of a written word, if you like. There is as well another layer, clearly this layer of the brochure is the layer of mobilization of the first words they acquired, but there are, of course, later layers as well. Here is an example of the sort of newspeak, if you like, of real socialist parlance, which was acquired by a person who clearly wanted to inspire his readers. So there is this assumed reader, which is a sort of like medal commission or something. And this biography, interestingly enough, the picture is not this one. The picture is only showing actually the title of the book. This is the entire thick as a brick autobiographical book, but the title is the 35th point of my personal questionnaire. So this is exactly the sort of a pun to this file autobiographies, because this guy wrote a book expanding on this open question at the end of his personal file. Anyway, but these personal files were quite often openly false. They were verified, as you said, so even the party was not interested in sort of giving money and various boni to people who were outright cheaters. And this was completely questioned. The colleagues from the factory said, no, it's bullshit. I mean, he invented everything. And it's actually visible because he's sort of inscribing himself to all the events he knew from somewhere. Yeah, but it's completely impossible that he participated in all of that. And interestingly, he's exactly writing exactly what he thinks his readers want to read. So he's using this sort of very conventionalized parlance, which would be found in this worst type of propagandistic newspaper in 55. But this is not the case in other autobiographies. These which are genuine, they are writing with the language from the leaflets of 1905 or 1907, because this was the language they sort of took with them. And where we are now. So this is a way to classify this oeuvre of autobiographies, which have different tropes, and these tropes are not completely incidental in respect to political affiliation. As I said before, there are different party tropes, and there are different biographies within these political structures. Today I was focusing on this one, and this is exactly, these are these autodidactic revolutionaries who got professionalized. I already mentioned this before. These people were more party activists. These were more, this is this right wing of socialism, later being the background of to some extent, backing up the state and seizure of power of the military commander Józef Piłsudski in 1918. So later being a sort of depositories of the official state memory as well. And they are using completely different forms. So this is not the Bildungsroman, as here, referring to more universal forms. These people are writing about their own self-enlightenment and the way to the world of letters and the world of communism, if you like. These people are using sort of a picaresque novel. So they are shooting to the Tsarist troops, undergoing various adventures, being as well expelled to Siberia. This is an adventurous way in the name of the socialist fatherland. Later, of course, not fulfilled, at least in the interwar period. And the nationalists, they are writing as veterans of labor the most, so they did not make this jump of upward mobility through politics, which was as well connected with a very complicated negotiation of leaving behind the class of origin. But nonetheless, within this field, there is a large level of legitimacy of the socialist state of real socialism, because these people, this is sort of what I would like to argue, found partial realization of these elements which layered themselves in time as they actively live their lives. And maybe this can open for the discussion. Thanks.
I thank the Fondazione Gramsci and Paolo for the invitation, as it has been an opportunity for me to delve deeper into autobiographical narratives, really describe them, which I mostly use as sources previously, so the text I'm going to address today are of different length and also of different types, I will say. In the fields of African American studies, as you might know, the biographies have been recognized for decades as legitimate and authoritative sites for theoretical production, not merely as literary artifacts or elusive sources. As John Blassingame pointed out in the 1970s, African American autobiographies provide a unique window into minority experiences. Also, they have been a consistent choice in African American literary output for over 2.5 centuries. Indeed, the African American autobiographical tradition traces its origins to the slave narrative genre. These texts, based on the author's personal experiences of slavery, began proliferating at the end of the 18th century. Today, they remain one of the most substantial bodies of literature produced by enslaved individuals. These narratives typically share several key elements: description of brutal treatment in plantations or enslavers' homes, moments of awakening to the justice of slavery, acts of resistance such as illicitly learning to read and write, and the pursuit of freedom, whether through escape, legal emancipation, or mission. Throughout, they critically address institutional slavery with moral and religious arguments and appeal to the reader to support abolitionist efforts. These narratives not only provided with personal accounts of suffering and resilience, but also acted as instruments for the abolitionist movement. They humanized the enslaved in the eyes of a broader audience and offered first-hand evidence against slavery. These narratives contested the ban on black literacy and refuted claims of their inability to produce literary and political documents. Blending personal urgency with a public imperative, they served as political treatises. The exemplary nature fostered collective identification aimed at action, while also nurturing a space for dissident memory. Similar to the political autobiography I will discuss today, these narratives reinscribed individual experiences within a collective framework. Their core facts then were involved the people, the events, and the dynamics that awakened the authors to awareness and action. Also, contemporary African-American political autobiography traced the process of self-definition of a liberated and radical subjectivity. They simultaneously clarify through analysis, conceptualization, and connection-making the systemic nature of racism in American society as an integral part of a worldwide system of exploitation. The African-American intellectual Y.I.B. Du Bois, for instance, described his third autobiography as a theory of his life. For many self-taught activists, particularly women, autobiographies serve as vital records that counteract historical oblivion by compensating for the absence of a formal theoretical legacy. 20th century autobiographies of African-American communists share also common themes. They often recount early personal experiences with systemic racism, such as segregated childhoods, violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and the frustrations of limited opportunities. Other types include the impact of the Great Migration, unemployment, workplace exploitation, and discriminatory practice in the military, all of which contribute to the development of racial and class consciousness. The influence of the slave narrative genre is frequently acknowledged in this work. Displacement, often echoing the trauma of the Atlantic slave trade or escapes from plantation slavery, is also a recurring theme. Claudia Jones' 1955 autobiographical letter to William Foster, then General Secretary of the Communist Party USA, exemplified this. Born in Trinidad in 1915 and emigrating during the post-war crisis, Jones' radicalization began upon confronting the harsh realities of the American dream after moving to Harlem. She wrote, I quote, "This dream was someone's abuse. Together with my educators, our family suffered not only the impoverished lot of working-class native families and its multinational populace, but early learned the special scourge of indignity stemming from Jim Crow national oppression, being Jim Crow a synonym for racial segregation in the US, as you know. I began to wonder why there was wealth and poverty, why there was discrimination and segregation, why there was a contradiction between these ideas contained in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which contain its precepts in the pursuit of all for life, liberty, and happiness. John's autobiography illustrates how radicalization in African American narratives is often intertwined with self-education, as we saw with Victor. Diagnosed with tuberculosis at age 17 in 1932, she spent a year in a sanatorium, at times she describes vividly. There too, she said, I had an opportunity to read avidly, to think deeply about the social ideas instilled in me by my mother and my father. After recovering, Jones took on various manual jobs and eventually worked for a black nationalist newspaper in the mid-30s, where she wrote summaries about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. During this period of intense anti-colonial mobilization in Harlem, she participated in meetings, and she was particularly, she said, impressed by the communist street speakers, noting their ability to connect racist violence, US to colonial wars in Africa. And this led to her joining the Youth Communist League in 1936. Life from then on is summarized in this letter almost in bullet points, focusing on her legal and health struggle as a lifelong communist. She faced imprisonment and persecution for her activities and party affiliation, serving 4 terms for un-American activities between 1948 and 1955. Although she applied for American citizenship at 22, her political activities from 18 led to its denial. So, facing deportation to Trinidad in 1955, she was denied again entry by British authorities, labeling her as potentially troublesome. And instead, she was offered residency in the UK, marking another displacement, exile, after 32 years in the US. But also a new chapter of political engagement with the British African Caribbean community and international women's movement. This biography's international ties to global communist and anti-colonial movements are often depicted through travel narratives. While traveling abroad, African American communists continued to view the world through the racial lens, frequently trying to apply the binary black and white division prevalent in American society to the regions they visited. These international experiences often helped the authors to deepen their understanding of race and discrimination. Many of these autobiographies recount extended stays in the Soviet Union, depicting it in almost utopic terms as a racial paradise where discrimination was absent. The most typical memoir I completed is this Black Man in Red Russia by Homer Smith, who was the Moscow correspondent for the Associated Negro Press, and it was published in 1964. Smith moved to the Soviet Union in 1932 after securing a job at the Moscow Post and Telegraphs, and he describes his motivation at the time. He asked what had started me, a 22-year-old American Negro, on the long road from Minneapolis to Moscow. To be free, he answered, to walk in dignity. I yearned to stand taller than I ever had, to breathe total freedom in great exhilarating gulps, to avoid all the hearts that were increasingly becoming the lot of men and women of color in the United States. The solution seemed simple to me. Russia was the only place where I could go and escape color discrimination entirely. Influenced by the global reports of the Soviet experiment in the Daily Worker, he thought, if Soviet Russia was, I quote, the only state which stood for social justice for all oppressed peoples, who was more oppressed than the Negro? He said, one day after some heated word in a restaurant about not getting waited on, I made my decision. So he left, and then his portrayal of Soviet attitudes towards Black Americans was hyperbolic. He said, if I had been looking for racial equality in Russia, I found it so abundant that it proved, in my opinion, to amount almost to racial inequality. Seeing this racial inequality in action, but in reverse order to what I had seen in America, proved intriguing and pleasant. End quote. Despite enjoying a privileged position as a foreign journalist with influential friends, Smith eventually rejected the Stalinist regime, citing food shortages, the Ukraine famine, the purge, and the shock of African American communists loved for white men dying in Gulag. Having left Russia in 1946, he reflected on his experiences, questioning, I quote, "Was the racial equality worth the bare subsistence living in an atmosphere filled with fear and suspicion? I believe that every Negro who lived in Russia was primarily interested in the equality that existed there. But was this enough compensation for the lack of material amenities and the absence of civil liberties? I cannot speak for all Negroes, but for me it was not." Claude McKay Autobiographies, A Long Way from Home, published in 1937, so much earlier, offer another enthusiastic account of Soviet attitudes towards Black Americans. The book detailed the travels of the Jamaican-American poet and journalist during the interwar years. McKay developed radical ideas from the mid-10s as a reader of the leftist American press and deepened his engagement during his stay in London from 19 to 1921. In his memoir, he explained that he participated in a club for colored soldiers and in a leftist one where he was intellectually challenged and began studying Marx diligently. After coming back to Harlem for a short time, he felt it as an urge to witness Russia's upheaval and grand experiment. Therefore, he left what he titled as the Magic Pilgrimage to Moscow from September 1922 to May 1923. As one of the first African-American visitors since the revolution, he received a triumphant welcome. He writes, "Wherever I appeared in the street, I was greeted by all of the people with enthusiasm. Never in my life did I feel prouder of being an African." He described feeling like a black icon in the flesh, with his image displayed in the streets together with the highest Soviet rulers. McKay relished the irony of his title. "For the first time in my life, I knew what it was to be a highly privileged personage and in the fatherland of communism." End quote. At the same time, he was aware of being used for propaganda purposes. Despite not being an organizer, he was called to participate in multiple meetings a day and played a visible, authoritative role in discussions of the Negro question at the fourth Congress of the Comintern. The famous picture of so in these autobiographies, the radicalization process, which in the case of McKay is only sketch because it was not communist for long, actually, about 15 years of radicalism. But this process is generally presented as the finding of an answer to a primarily racial question, echoing again the slave narrative genre, a background of oppressive experiences during childhood in a context of normalized, unequal racial relations culminates in an awakening, often triggered by an episode of significant violence. This is evident in Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood, published in 1978. Haywood framed his narrative as a political autobiography, beginning with a pivotal moment, which was the 1919 Chicago race riot, a week of violence by white mobs against black residents. Having served in a segregated army during World War I and experienced mistreatment from white superiors, Haywood returned to the US to confront further disillusionment and repression. Reflecting on these experiences, he remarked, "Conditions in the States had not changed, but we blacks had." And the prologue opens. On July 28, 1919, I literally stepped into a battle that was to last the rest of my life. It came to me that I had been fighting the wrong war. The Germans weren't the enemy was right here at home. These ideas had been developing ever since I landed home in April, and a lot of other black veterans were having the same thoughts. It was the great turning point in my life, he explained. I began to see that I had to commit myself to struggle against that made racism possible. So the central entry of this autobiography seeks both an explanation and a solution to the race question, so the systematic condition of subjugation and exploitation of African Americans and other racialized groups striving for liberation. Thus, these works chronicle the author's journeys toward articulating and responding to this question, blending personal stories with theoretical political analysis. Following this incipit, Haywood restarts from the beginning. And he tells his stories from childhood. He says that he was raised in an insulated environment and was initially only dimly aware of racial divisions. His awareness grew through stories from his parents and grandparents about their experiences of slavery and resistance, like his grandfather showing scars from an overseas slash and recounting an escape from a lynching attempt by the Ku Klux Klan. And his father, a manual worker with little formal education, taught himself to read and write, becoming a prodigious reader. His extensive knowledge had to dispel the myths of civilizational inferiority taught to his sons at school. After a racist attack forced the family to move from South Omaha to Minneapolis, Harry at 15 left school. Although largely self-taught, he later became an assiduous student as a communist militant. Returning to Chicago after the war, he founded the city to be a hub for black proletarians and was drawn into the radical sector of the labor movement, influenced by his brother Otto, a member of the Communist Party and of the African Black Brotherhood. His political education continued through readings and discussion circles, transitioning him from, I quote, a disgruntled black ex-soldier to a self-conscious revolutionary looking for an organization. Despite the significance of the Russian Revolution, it said slowly dawned on him as a tangible accomplishment and real power. He was particularly attracted by the communists because, despite their being mostly white, they were the most sincerely internationalist-minded. This was so, he believed, because American communists, I quote, was a part of a world revolutionary movement and uniting Chinese, Africans, Americans with European and North Americans through the Third Communist International. This belief was reinforced during his time in Moscow at the Stalin University of the Daughters of the East, established by the Bolsheviks to train cadres from the Soviet peripheries and the Global South. He compared his journey to Moscow when he was passed from one group of comrades to the next to the Underground Railroad, a secret network of routes and safe houses that enslaved African Americans used to escape to free states in the 19th century. At the Stalin University, Black Americans were grouped together with students from Asia and Africa. Haywood recalls he struggled to perfect the Russian language, the coursework, and the interracial camaraderie existed amongst Americans, Africans, and Dark Indians who had their experiences of racial abuse. In 1927, he was the first black student to be transferred to Lenin University, a select training school for Comintern party's cadre. Haywood's autobiography keeps detailing his life until his expulsion from the party in 1959. He attributed this to the party's neglect of black self-determination and the rural South. Nevertheless, it is known that his expulsion was due to his staunch anti-revisionist stance, marking him as an unrepentant black Stalinist of his political career. James Yates' autobiography, Mississippi to Madrid, published in 1989, offers from the perspective of a lesser-known militant rather than a leader. His grandparents were slaves in Mississippi, and his family frequently moved in search of work. Yates recalled experiences of segregation, an attempted lynching of his uncle, and racial wage discrimination on farms. Moving to Chicago in 1923, he worked as a railroad waiter. The nationwide crisis of unemployment, he became politically active. He frequented the Washington Park's Bug Club, a forum for radicals, where he first listened to Claude Lightfoot, a young African-American communist, whose words inspired him to join a miners' march to Springfield. He says, I caught the fever and found myself singing with a passion I hadn't felt for years. He recounts, suddenly I had felt as one with these people, black and white. I was a part of their hopes, their dreams, and they were a part of mine. And we were a part of an even larger world of marching poor people. Realizing the global scale of the depression, he felt empowered by the recognizing black waiters, which further marginalized him as an agitator. In 1935, Yates moved to New York, jobless and in despair, and was found drunk on a bench by two communists. Noticing that Yates had been reading Du Bois and Marx, and that he had been active in Chicago. They reintegrated him into Harlem's union activities. His involvement intensified during the Italo-Ethiopian War, again a turning point, leading him to finally join the international brigades. Yates wrote his autobiography, his memoir actually, although it embraced most of his life, primarily to reflect the Black experience in the Spanish Civil War, a topic that formed the bulk of his narrative. He articulated his motivation when he decided to leave for Spain. What would things be like in the US with Hitler and with Bilbo, who was the segregationist governor of Mississippi as his lieutenant? I realized that if the fascists were not defeated in Spain, a bigger war would surely come soon. So Yates marched from France to Spain, climbing the Pyrenees, and evoking there a connection between runaways from slavery and internationalist solidarity. He wrote, "We arrived at our third Spanish outpost, an empty monastery. It was midway down the mountain and served as a station for the volunteers who had been forced to take this route into Spain. It struck me that this monastery was much like the places used by the abolitionists who temporarily housed slaves escaping from the plantations of the South. During the training, he found that every nationality in the world seemed to be represented. Singing the Internationale with them, he felt, I quote, an overwhelming sense of kinship with all the people around. And also for the African Americans in the Lincoln Brigade, it was the first experience in an unsegregated US military unit. The last pages of his autobiography list 83 Black volunteers from North America known to have served in the Spanish Civil War, prior to any historiographical productions on the topic. Then Yates was severely injured after a German bombing near Alicante, only for interrogation and surveillance by the FBI for the rest of his life. His passport was withheld until 1971, effectively placing him in a sort of reverse exile. Upon regaining his ability to travel, Yates revisited Spain, place where for the first time in my life I experienced what it was to be a free man. During a stop in Barcelona, he distributed Free Angela Davis buttons, linking his past anti-fascist struggle with contemporary movements, as he was an organizer for this campaign at the time in the US. So the autobiography of Angela Davis herself, published in 1974, is probably the most famous autobiography by the African-American communists. It is worth to say a few words, being also one of the few female testimonies of the Black Power movement. Born in the segregation of Birmingham, Alabama in 1944, her early exposure to violence shapes her narrative. Her academic journey, funded by scholarship in the US, France, and Germany, introduced her to radical thought. So it was a different way of getting close to these readings. Studying Marx, she describes a transformative realization about racism as the inevitable fruit of a ruthless system which stays alive and vital by encouraging contempt, rivalry, and oppression from one group over another. It was as if an expert surgeon had removed cataracts from her eyes. Davis joined the Black Panther Party in 1968 while working at the University of California under Herbert Marcuse. Her reflection contrasts with those of male contemporaries, emphasizing the gender dynamics within the organizations she participated in. She criticized the machismo in leadership models and the domineering tendencies of male leaders who often relegate women activists to organizational roles, labeling them as too authoritarian and accusing them of attempting a matriarchal coup when they contested the hierarchies. Then in 1969, Davis also became a member of the Che Lumumba Club, a black club within the Communist Party USA. Becoming a communist to her meant to be able to balance the culturalist tendencies within the black nationalist movement and elaborate an intersectional analysis of black women's oppression. The autobiographies of black communists interconnect and influence one another. Here, Davis was particularly inspired by Du Bois, frequently consulting the passages about his joining the Communist Party in his third autobiography before making her own commitment. This autobiography that Du Bois finished writing when he was about to leave for Ghana in 1961, where he spent his final years, reflect a profound shift in his perspective. At age 93, he officially finally joined the Communist Party USA. His narrative aimed to review my life, he says, as frankly and fully as I can, marking an attempt to reconcile his changed worldview. And he had already written two semi-autobiography before. His endorsement culminates in the middle of the book in a two-page interlude titled Communism. He said, like the beginning was, I have studied socialism and communism long and carefully in lands where they are practiced and in conversation with their adherents and with wide reading. I now state my conclusion frankly and clearly. I believe in communism. And the remainder of the book seeks to elucidate this journey to this belated faith. While the book's second section chronologically reconstructs his youth and adulthood as a scholar and an articulated leader, the first section, on which I will briefly focus, serves as a travelogue. After being denied a passport by the government for 7 years, he left the US in 1958. He chose to detail this late journey because of the wide influence it had on his thought. He first returned to Britain and France, I quote, to learn if now European imperialism was about to disappear and what hope we had of a future. Was a world of peace and racial equality about to emerge? I was disappointed, he says. Western Europe was not ready to renounce the benefits of colonial exploitation, not even his labor parties. Visiting the Netherlands, he connects the present of colonial injustice to his personal history. I quote, it was a Dutchman who in the early 18th century kidnapped my great-grandfather on the coast of West Africa and sold him into slavery in the valley of the Hudson, end quote. Now Dutch colonies were still struggling for freedom. This book is fully a Cold War product through which Du Bois accused the US of backing Europe's imperialism and praised Soviet support to anti-colonial struggles. His narrative then follows his fourth tour of the Soviet Union, where he attended the Conference of Asian and African Writers at Tashkent, a multinational gathering which reinforced his faith in Soviet support to the cultural and political empowerment of the Global South. The travelogue concludes with a 3-month stay in China, revisiting a country that he had first seen in 1936. His return was motivated by a desire to reconnect with the, I quote, a land of colored people who had endured an oppression worse than Negro slavery, but were now leading a socialist transformation. Despite deteriorating Soviet-Chinese relations, Du Bois had long meetings with both Khrushchev and Mao Zedong before returning to Moscow for May Day. In his autobiography, Du Bois documents the last speeches he delivered at Pan-African venues, focusing particularly on Sino-African relations. His testament was a vision of China as a model and a potential ally for African nations, aiming to carve out post-colonial futures independent from Western exploitation.
So, thank you for connecting, and I hope that everything will technically work, so I need to close.
Thank you so much, Paolo, for the invitation and for the organization. Also, thanks to Virginia for being in touch via email. Today, I'll be discussing about pioneers of women's economic development, the biographical narratives of Gramsci and Mina Mazumdar. And these women are considered pioneers of the Indian women's movement, and I will talk more extensively about why this is the case. So, Mazumdar wrote Memories of a Rolling Stone in 2010, while Jane published the Brass Notebook in 2020. And I must say that these are autobiographies I knew of, and there will be more, of course. Autobiographies are a popular genre among Indian activist women of different political beliefs, spanning from nationalists to socialists to communists. And in 2013, the Center for Women's Development Studies in New Delhi compiled an annotated bibliography of biographies and autobiographies of Indian women, which showed the widespread adoption of this genre in different Indian states and among different language groups. Biography, instead, in comparison to autobiography, appear to be less popular among women and more common for male authors and male subjects, with the exception of a record number of biographies devoted to India's only woman prime minister, namely Indira Gandhi. There are 84 biographies of Indira Gandhi. So this paper today won't deal with the communist women. I know you'll be talking about communist activists. I will refer back to some work I did on communist activists in Italy. Sorry, my voice is really bad, so I hope you will hold up till the end. But rather, I will talk about pioneers of the women's movement and of institutional activism in India. So both women are considered pioneers in their fields, in their academic fields, but also as activists. Veena Mazumdar was educated in Calcutta, Banaras, and Oxford. She taught political science at Patna University for nearly a decade, and was later appointed as the member secretary of the Committee on the Status of Women in India, and later was director, Program of Women's Studies, Indian Council of Social Science Research for 5 years, and also director of the Center for Women's Development Studies in New Delhi, which is basically the main center for women's studies at that time. She was the founding member of the Indian Association of Women's Studies in 1982, and she served as the chairperson of this Center for Women's Development Studies for a long time, until 2005. So, and then Devaki Jay is an economist. She's still alive. She was born in 1933. She's an economist, graduated from St. Anne's College, Oxford. She was a lecturer in economics at Delhi University from 63 to 69. And she was also part of the South Commission, chaired by Julius Nyerere from Tanzania. And over the course of her career, she founded a wide range of institutions. For instance, the Institute of Social Studies Trust. She was also founding member of the Indian Association for Women's Studies, as well as the organization named Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era, DAWN, which was especially active during the Nairobi Conference of 1985. And is a third world network of women social scientists. She has been also the author of many books, including Women Development and the UN, a 60-year quest for equality and justice. So, again, we could see here that it happened to me before to work on women, work on biographies. I will mention it as well later, that it's not only the biography of the retelling of the life of the woman, but it's also an analysis that you get with it, because these women are public figures, scholars, social scientists, so it's very much, there are different meta levels happening there in the biographies, autobiographies. I just have a disclaimer before I properly start. So I'm not an expert by any means of the Indian subcontinent, but I started reading on Indian women's organizations and movements as a result of my research interest in socialist Yugoslavia and non-aligned connections during the Cold War. Following the trajectory of Slovenian politician Vida Tomšič, which was very much active around the UN decade for women, I was brought to the narratives of Mazumdar and Jane, who connected with Yugoslav delegates, especially between 1975 and 1985 during the decade, over issues of women's emancipation, economic and social development, and non-aligned activism. They were trying to bring the non-aligned perspective to the UN. The current project I'm leading on the history of women in the non-aligned movement adopts a specifically biographic and intersectional perspective, attending to women activists and their individual trajectories, but also to their embodied positionings and how they've been shaped by gender, class, ethnicity, nationality, generation, education, and other factors of social differentiation. And this approach, which originates from Black and post-colonial feminism, resonates with the autobiographies I'm looking at today, which are written by women, as I said, who are primarily scholars and aware, obviously, of such intersections. As Anya Lumba writes, partly because women's emancipation in India was, as a large part of the colonized world, intertwined complexly with the struggle for independence, feminist scholarship on India has always been sharply conscious of the historical connections between women's personal, sexual, and political freedoms and the larger structures of political power. End of quote. Just as a comparison, while studying the many biographies, autobiographies and memoirs of Italian communist activists born in the 20s and 30s who published their memoirs in the 2000s, mainly in 2010, towards the end of their lives, so this intersectional dimension was mostly limited to issues of gender, class, and generation. The big events that characterized 20th century European history became key moments of one's lives, and in the biographies by women such as Rossana Rossanda, Marisa Ombra, Bianca Guidetti Serra, Luciana Viviani, Marisa Rodan, and others, the feminist opposition to fascism and anti-Semitism, the participation in the resistance during World War II, the fact of joining the Communist Party in the early Cold War era, and some certain disillusion about the USSR during the Stalinization were key moments, as well as it was the encounter with feminism in the 1970s, when they were part of organizations such as the Union of Italian Women, or were not, like Rossana Rossanda, for instance, she was not part of the women's organization, but she also had a very meaningful encounter with second wave feminism. In the case of the autobiographies of Veena Mazumdar and Devaki Jain, however, key historical events appear somehow at a distance, and so does the collective dimension of party politics and of mass women's organization. They're not specifically involved in any party, and the big mass organizations active in post-independence India, such as the All India Women's Conference, connected to the All India Women's Conference, connected to the Congress Party, the National Federation of Indian Women connected to the Communist Party of India, the All India Democratic Women Association, and others are mentioned only in passing by Mazumdar, and they get almost no mention in Jane's memoir. One event that gets mentioned towards the mid-70s is this moment of the emergency, when Indira Gandhi repressed the opposition and curtailed the civil liberties. I'm going to come back to that. And then the other moment that's kind of remembered is the assassination of Gandhi in 1948. Certainly the independence struggle figures as an important context in the life of the protagonists as they grow up. They're too young to take part in politics, they're women, so it's usually mainly a man. There were, of course, nationalist women involved in the independence struggle, but they're not part of that circle. But this independence struggle and independence moment is mainly marking their parents' generation, especially the fathers who are first part of the English administration, and then of the independent government after 1947. And they crossed the path with the figure of Gandhi as collaborator. So Adel Mazumdar was building the railway, and he refused. He stepped down during the independence when he's told to destroy a railway to fight against the British. And then the father of Jane, he was a local governor, so he was a bit more prominent. Independence, however, has a strong influence on both of them, as it brings us birth modernization and equal rights for women in the field of education and the professions. They're the first women in the family to be able to pursue their studies further than primary education, while their respective mothers had very limited access to formal education for both of them. And they're helping this by their upper and middle class and caste background, which allows them to access private Catholic schools and then an English education abroad, at both Oxford University and different colleges. In both autobiographies, overcoming gender boundaries is made possible due to class privilege and education. The retelling of the college years in Oxford becomes a defining moment of self-individuation, resilience, and gaining knowledge of a bigger world, travels, hitchhiking, very, very free somehow experience for girls who came from a quite restrained background. And the knowledge is then brought back to India as professional women in order to improve not only their own individual destiny, but also the lives of the Indian female masses as a whole. Both narrators tell of strenuous, daring fights with existing institutions and of this daily struggle to improve institutions and engage with the creation of new ones in the form of new research centers, NGOs, reform of educational patterns. For instance, Veena Mazumdar speaks a lot about how she's reformed the whole teaching assessment at Patna University because it was not serious enough, and then she really tried to improve the students' grades and how they were assessed. It's this institutional activism that brings both of them in touch with working class and peasant Indian women who live different femininities at the margins of the Indian dream of democracy and modernization. Similarly to Italian Communist Party activists of middle-class upbringing who encountered factory workers, rice readers, and olive pickers through the investigation led by the Communist Party, the trade unions, and the Union of Italian Women, Rina Mazumdar and Devaki Jain were brought in touch with rural women in faraway localities through sociological and political research projects funded by different state institutions and research centers. The encounter with downtrodden, invisible women happens especially during the UN Decade for Women, running from 1975 to 1985, which pushes for an enormous production of knowledge on women's status, turning the protagonist's expertise gained in Oxford into a valuable resource not only nationally but also internationally. Because during the decade, as we know, each country needed to organize in-depth investigations on the ground because the UN asked India, as any other country, to send statistical data, sociological data of the condition of women. Governments all over the world were invited to do this formal recognition of women's condition and to act upon it in order to improve women's access to land, food, education, the professions, welfare, and so on. So the establishment of national machineries, as they were called, for the advancement of women leads Mazumdar and Jain to put their knowledge at work and to discover the profound impact of gender differences combined with class, caste, and other inequalities that they were not. That they were aware of, but they didn't have a sense of how much it affected women, especially in the countryside. As Mazumdar herself wrote in 1994 in a scholarly article, I quote, "Investigations into women's marginalization and exploitation in the economy, both formal and informal, in the educational process, in communication and media, and also in the political process, have turned women's studies into one of the major critics of the pattern of development and the choice of strategies." This critique of the development put in place by the government, especially when it came to issues such as peasant women, but also to issues such as what they call reservation, so the quota for women in political parties, brought Indian feminists to critically engage and negotiate with state institutions. And Indian scholar Chaudhuri, she says, for Indian feminism, the relationship to the state was both crucial and double-edged. While on the one hand, women, particularly poor women, face the violent edge of the state, it is the state that the women's movement sought ameliorative intervention from. So, I kind of quote. So, in a way, there was this process of negotiation with the state, because on the one hand, state institution was seen as a bulwark against the threat of religious and communal violence, and both of them mentioned this clashes that happened after the partition between India and Pakistan, but also after the death of Gandhi. So this always omnipresent threat of communal violence, religious strife, and so on between the different ethnic groups. But also at the same time, they mentioned the moment of the emergency. So when they're doing all this research on women, it's the moment when the leader of the country, which happens to be a woman, Indira Gandhi, repressed the opposition, encouraged the civil liberty, and so that's also a moment of contradiction somehow, that the government is giving so much money for women's studies at the time in which all the other freedoms are somehow capped. Right? So this engagement with the state is directly connected to the need to maintain a vision of national progress, and as Chaudhuri again said, the class mattered, and the peasant and working class woman was seen as the face of the Indian nation and the state. So this nationalist imaginary, which had different sources, she said, such as Marx and Gandhi, somehow couldn't bypass this idea of universalism, right? So this engagement with state institution is seen by the protagonist as a way to push for wide institutional reform. And this is not only a phenomenon that's present in India this time, but I would argue that this is characteristic of what has been defined as the red wave, or the last wave of women's activism during the Cold War at the global level. And in the case of Italy, as we know, such engagement with state and party politics and with emancipation came to be seen as not sufficiently radical by the feminist second wave, which demanded liberation and the overturn of existing structure, not women's integration into existing structures. However, this does not seem to be the case with narrators in question, who are still hailed by third wave and fourth wave feminists, we could say, as pioneers of women's studies and of the feminist and women's movement in India, especially because of this building of institutions such as the Center for Women's Development Studies, or the DAWN organization. One thing to remark, which probably links to this global generation of Cold War activists, is that the personal lives of the protagonists somehow remain in the shade of their educational and institutional trajectories and of the many encounters and friendships that punctuated them. So in both autobiographies there is this emphasis on the family, on the important figures within the families, aunts, cousins, brothers, sisters, important figures, teachers that they encountered in their education in India, in their education in Oxford, scholars they were inspired by. There is much of that, of these encounters. However, issues such as mental health struggles, marriage troubles, children, which both had 4 children, and Devaki had 2 children, divorce, Veena Mazumdar divorced at a certain point, and sexual harassment experience that I'm going to come back to about Devaki are addressed, yes, bravely, openly, we could say, without moralism or let's say too much. They're quite discussed quite open, but they almost always appear as obstacles that need to be overcome in order to get back to work. So there is this sense that these issues are private and should be left in the private sphere. And this was common, as Anya Lumba remarks, also among communist Indian women. She wrote a book, Revolutionary Desires, which is inspired by her own experience as a daughter of a communist couple. And she said, I quote, "My mother too inhabited this mixture of radicalism and prudishness. While enormously supportive of women who broke the bounds of convention, she was unable to talk about emotion or sexuality with her daughters. She expected them to be strong and independent women, and indeed helped them to become so, but always with the sense that female strength demanded putting one's emotional self in cold storage." End of quote. This was common in the biographies of other communist and left-wing women of this generation, particularly the Italian women I studied, in which the consequences of the double morality and hypocrisy of male party leaders are mentioned, discussed. Remember the famous story in Teresa Noce's autobiography about Luigi Longo dissolving the wedding without her knowing. She learns it from the newspaper, right? So there are all these instances of double morality, but they're quickly brushed aside to keep going and keep doing the job that is required. So in the rest of the paper, so this is kind of an overview of the themes, common themes that come up in both autobiographies. Now I would like to read some quotes from the autobiographies themselves, which mostly give a sense of the style and of the tone of the narratives. And if we look at the two works from a literary point of view, I would say that Devaki Jain's writing is certainly more polished, more poetic, more artistic, we could say. Veena Mazumdar's autobiography is much more factual, and it's less maybe artistic, but they both have a sense of authenticity and immediacy, and they're both very, very good and nice to read. So I hope I'm doing okay with time. Let me know if I don't have too much left. So an important part of the autobiographies details the struggle that the protagonists underwent when studying abroad and establishing themselves in the professions, making their way into the world on their own. So Jane writes about her admission at Ruskin College at Oxford, a college which was mainly dedicated to working class students. So she couldn't get into other ones, and she knew that there was somehow a scholarship from this Ruskin College, and she was admitted. And many years later, she said, I had a chance to ask the principal, Mr. H.D. Hughes, why he let me in. Pure amusement, he said, at the sight of this evidently upper-class Indian girl in her early 20s, asking desperately to be allowed to study alongside men and women in their 30s with more than 10 years of hard manual labor behind them. How, he said, could he resist such a social experiment? Besides, he had felt moved at the desperation he could feel in me to study the atmosphere of Oxford. He felt that I would put it to good use. So that's a quote, because indeed this Ruskin College was not an upper class place, but it was more for working class students, and she also enjoyed very much meeting working class classmates in Ruskin. Jane also briefly tells of the time when she had to face sexual harassment on behalf of an important male academic in the field of economics, for whom she was working as a research assistant while at Oxford, which left her with a significant degree of psychological trauma. So because of this, she failed her exam because of this anxiety that she got. So she said, but the real blow came 3 years later when I sat for the final exam for the degree. I could not write answers. I found myself go blank. The assault and rejection by the professor had destroyed my self-worth. With great difficulty, the compassionate nuns of Oxford allowed me to pass and get my degree, but it was not a good outcome. My teachers could not understand what had happened to a student they considered one of the best and expected to get what in Oxford is called a congratulatory first. Okay, so that's quite... this whole issue is discussed quite openly in the book, and I think that's very much a reflection also of the Me Too movement that she's aware of and so on. An interesting one from Mazumdar, she's telling what happened after she came back from Oxford to India and decided to look for a teaching job. She was afraid of her father's reaction and she asked for his permission. So she said, returning to India in 1950, I wanted to look for a job and wondered what I would do if my father said it was against the family tradition. I was unprepared for his positive response to my desire to teach. Seeing my surprise, he explained that he was prepared for such a logical event because, he said, during the years that you've been away, the country has adopted a new constitution, which tells me that I cannot discriminate between you and your brothers. I always told them that my responsibility is to equip them to stand on their own feet afterwards. Now I must apply the same principle to you. Why do you look so surprised? Don't you know that I've always been a law-abiding man? When the law changes, I must adapt myself to its requirements, he said. It was going to take me nearly 25 years to realize that very few Indian fathers, brothers, or husbands share that kind of respect for the law. So in the sense, the law is helping her to get this teaching job and to convince her father. Now, there's another interesting story in Jane's biography, which is the one about marrying outside the caste. She came from a Brahmin, so the highest caste, and she fell in love with a man who was from the Jain caste, which is a kind of commercial caste that is considered inferior. And she decided to get married. So she said, we got married in secret on May 6, 1966. It had to be so as my younger sister's marriage would have been jeopardized if it was known that a member of the family had married outside the caste. I could announce it only after she was safely married, which fortunately had been arranged for later that year. So, and then she had some conflict with the family, which was eventually solved. But still, the life as a wife and as a mother of two children made it very difficult to continue her professional career. And so once she said, what I once said to Lakshmi, is a wife. I see that. I said, can I be your wife? But she replied, don't be silly. I said, that would double my work, to keep house for you and then to teach you to be my wife. So even in these couples that were, let's say, formally equal, and that were a good match because they had a good relationship and a good marriage until the end, it was hard to combine this productive and reproductive labor. And Veena Mazumdar also struggled with her marriage while moving across India for different jobs. The husband would follow her in different institutions, and eventually she divorced in the mid-70s when her children were already grown up. Just when she was about to undertake this titanic task of drafting towards equality, which was the 500 pages report on the condition of women in India commissioned by the government for International Women's Year in 1975. With a team of fellow researchers, Mazumdar produced the first sociological and statistical overview of the position of women in different fields of Indian society, from industry to countryside and so on. And she just threw herself into this job as a way to forget her private issues. And she said, my yearly struggles represented an individual woman's effort to balance the demands of professional and familial responsibilities. The new struggle was increasingly a collective ideological one to rediscover the Indian nation, the world, the past, the present and the future from the perspective of India's hidden and unacknowledged majority, poor working women in rural and urban areas. And just a couple more quotes and I want to conclude. So Devaki Jain also carried out several rounds of fieldwork as part of her career as an economist during the Grand Decade for Women. She wrote, "Our interest in women and their work took us to sectors of the economy where women, by virtue of their supposed nimble fingers, were the sole workers, peeling prawns without damaging them, the husking cashew nuts, picking tea leaves, rolling biddies, rolling out papads, weeding fields, transplanting paddy, unsealing cotton pods. These were all delicate operations that required skill and experience to be done and were crucial to the overall processes they were part of. But we found that the women were nearly always paid low wages despite how demanding the tasks were and rarely covered by the protections in labor legislation." And so this idea that these poor women, lowly paid women were kind of the motor of Indian economics, this became a key element into this new vision of gender development for both of them. The awareness of her privilege did not stop Jane from being treated as a third world woman in UN conferences, however, especially when she associated with Western colleagues. This is why she called the Dawn Association to provide an alternative to Western recipes for development. And I will just conclude on this interesting quote, which is about speaking up as third world women. So Jane wrote, "On my various trips abroad as a representative of third world women, I began to notice a disturbing but entirely predictable pattern. These meetings always involve technocrats, usually male and from the countries located in the northern hemisphere and the home of the colonizers. These experts took it upon themselves to simultaneously define their terminology, describe the experience of people from everywhere in the world, and to prescribe solutions. They were there to teach, we to learn. They didn't seem to think they had anything to learn from us, or we anything to teach them." And that's why she created this organization and engaged with this institution to show that she has something to say. So I think I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for organizing the workshop, the seminar. It has been very interesting, and I've been learning a lot. Before just starting my presentation, I will talk about two different, although related, historical contexts. One of them has to do with the history of communism in Portugal, mainly from the 40s onwards, and the other context, and that will be the second half of my presentation, has to do with the anti-colonial nationalist movements struggle against the Portuguese Empire, which, in the chronology there, it is pretty much it has to do with the late 50s, early 60s onwards, and in the case of the history of Portuguese communism, that is something that I have studied. Therefore, I do have some, at least partially consolidated ideas to present to you. On the second case, although I have also studied some African anti-colonial movements, namely ones related to Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, this photo has to do with that context. The issue of autobiographies has not been studied neither by me nor by other colleagues, so I will just make some exploratory comments on this. Before this, just to explain to you how I want to somehow frame this my intervention, and at the same time establishing some relations to what we have been discussing before, and also in the morning. So we were trying to situate already in the introductory remarks by Paolo, autobiography as a kind of a device that negotiates between the individual and the collective, or more than negotiating between the individual and the collective, more than a dispositive that allows us to negotiate between the individual and the collective, as perhaps a dispositive that actually configures or produces, makes the individual and the collective. So it's not that it's something that is an instrument, a device, a tool that reflects previous entities or subjectivities or subjects, but it produces them. So one way we were discussing this in the morning, for state apparatus, for political leaderships, for central committees, for whoever is in charge to control those who are submitted to his power, is to create them as individuals. So it's not only the problem, or the question is not only how those who have the power control those who have not the power and therefore deny their individuality, but how, by creating them as individuals, how that creation is part of the kind of, like in Foucauldian terms, governmental relation being established. In the sense that, for instance, we know this for many reasons. If you want to make someone pay taxes, you need to create him as an individual with his own record. Therefore, the creation of individuals and using and the control of the collective is part of the same history. So this would be my first introductory comment, and therefore the point is that the history of autobiographies, or the history of communist autobiographies, is obviously related to the history of many other forms of non-communist autobiographical practices. Okay. In the case of the communist parties, we already mentioned this. There is a history of the autobiography of communist militants, cadres. Part of that history had to do with using autobiography as a way to demonstrate or to identify skills, individual skills, and this is something that also happened in the case of the Portuguese Communist Party, obviously, and the practice became somehow widespread in the late 30s, early 40s, in the context of the Comintern. So we can easily identify the first questionnaires being developed in the case of the Portuguese Communist Party as being implemented by the members of the Communist Portuguese Party that were actually in Moscow in 34, 36, and it is mainly in the 40s, when there is this reorganization process in the Communist Portuguese Party, that this kind of practice becomes more common. The idea is obviously to select the militants that would better serve the party. So the ritual of fulfilling these kind of questionnaires and writing autobiographies in this specific context is pretty much similar to what happened in the French case, as Fudal and others have studied. It seems similar to what happened in the Italian case as well. And therefore, in this context, autobiography can be seen as a kind of form of purification also, that is of identification, but also of producing a disciplined militant. In the case of the Portuguese Communist Party, this was very relevant in the sense that the reorganization of the party in the 40s was with the aim to create a clandestine underground party that actually was illegal for more than 3 decades, from the early 40s until 74. And in the case of the Portuguese Communist Party, and and that was a difference with the Spanish Communist Party. Most of the leaders of the Communist Party spent the whole period of illegality within the country. And therefore, the questionnaire, for instance, has perhaps some specificities who have to do with the capacity to resist to the police in case of imprisonment, for instance. There are several questions that have to do with the possibility of, if you are arrested, do you think that you would resist properly? How do you deal with physical pain and with emotional sufferance, etc.? So there are some specificities that have to do with this specific national context. Nevertheless, sometimes, circumstances also play a very relevant role, and obviously, when there are moments of significant repression by the political police, and there is a wave of imprisonments because someone who was arrested was not able to resist to torture and denounce other militants, there was the need to replace those who were arrested, and these kind of procedures were not implemented often in practical terms. So they would just be kind of formal procedures that in reality would not be applied. The production of autobiographies in the late 30s, but mainly in the 40s, created also specific departments within the party to control these processes. They were actually called commissions of control that would work attached to the central committee or to the executive secretariat of the party. And in this, in the activity of these specific departments, one of the things that was a kind of a permanent concern was to identify the militants that would be more able to assume individual responsibility. This idea of one of the problems of the party was that there were many militants that were not capable of that were lacking the capacity to assume individual responsibility. This kind of concern was very present already in the 40s. Then in the 60s, when there is a second moment of internal crisis, and this is obviously very interesting because you have this kind of communist party that one of the things that is trying to produce is individuals who have the capacity, kind of entrepreneur skills that allow them to be true Bolsheviks. And it is also very interesting because in the 60s, the concerns and of the main leaders of the party that were ahead of this sector were actually formulated in quite similar terms to the concerns that public managers had with public workers, for instance. That you need to produce public workers that have the will to assume their own individuality in the way they perform their own tasks. So there is obviously, once again, processes of making responsible individuals that are connected or that have some similarities between political life and the non-political life, and in this case, crisscrossing, the resistance and the development of state activities. One other element that I think it is worth mentioning has to do with the role of these autobiographies in the development of the activities of the police, the repressive activities of the police. So often these autobiographies, these short or longer texts, but they were usually like 2 to 3 pages tagged. When they were caught by the police, they were after used by the police in order to interrogate those that they were able to imprison. And it is very interesting then to see in this case, to compare the autobiographies that were written and the biographies or the biographical account that the police produces, trying to establish what is true and what is not true in the autobiographies, interrogating the communist militants through their own autobiographical description, and then the police producing his own biographical account of the militant. So there is one moment in internal debate within the Portuguese Communist Party in the 60s where actually the production of these autobiographies is being questioned by some of those who are ahead of the party because they are considered as documents that should be produced. They can be used by the party leadership to select those who would go to clandestinity and those who would not go and those who would remain in an open situation. But there is the indication that all these documents should be destroyed immediately after, just for security reasons. So these kind of autobiographical accounts are obviously only part of this production of the militant and of the self-production of the militant. Biographies that were sometimes written by both the biographer and the intellectuals or the cadres of the party that were assigned with this mission was also part of this imagination production of the militant. Although biographical accounts were very, very few. I mean, the first biographical account produced by the Portuguese Communist Party on one communist militant was produced in 1954, and it was dedicated to Álvaro Cunhal, who was by then already one of the 2 or 3 main historical leaders of the party, was in prison, and the biographical account is mainly produced in order to help the campaign against his imprisonment. But this is produced in 1954, shortly before, in the Soviet Union, the criticism against the cult of personality is being developed. So, in the years after, the campaign for Cunhal still uses the biographical accounts, but in a very cautionary way, not at the same time trying to avoid the cult of personality that was being criticized in the Soviet Union by then, having in mind obviously the recent death of Stalin. Nevertheless, one thing that is relevant in this production of biographical accounts is that they somehow escape the control of the communist Portuguese party. So, for instance, when they are trying to avoid the multiplication of biographical, kind of hagiographical accounts of Cunhal, the Communist Party in Chile, for instance, publishes a poem by Pablo Neruda on Cunhal that was, spread all over the international circuits of the communist movement. So, therefore, the international solidarity campaigns often also contributed to this idea of individualizing the militant. Obviously, the leader, in the case of the Communist Party, or the case of Cunhal, but not only the leader, also these kind of ordinary militant typical figures, like, for instance, a peasant woman that was killed by the police. The name of Caterina Femi in a rural in a rural worker strike, during a rural worker strike. So she's also, her case is also turning to a kind of biographical account that would counter the more geographical and classical account of the great man, and that was the case of Cunhal. So the international dimension of this process is very relevant. I mean, not only because one can say that in the early 30s, in the late 30s, early 40s, there was this kind of import of the type of questionary and autobiographical writing that the Comintern was developing, but also after World War II, with this kind of international solidarity campaigns, these campaigns are developed through this individual form of the non-anonymous militant, and therefore they use these biographical or autobiographical accounts in a kind of propagandistic way. So then there's another dimension that plays a major role here, but mainly in the final decades of the 20th century. That is autobiographies, but kind of testimonial literature, the production, the writing of memory, of personal memories. Although in the case of the Portuguese Communist Party, and in this case perhaps there are also some differences that should be at least identified. I mean, the Portuguese Communist Party still is, or at least it still was, in the late 90s and in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, a major or significant player in the Portuguese political arena. So you don't have because of that perhaps, you don't have the production of memories of the anti-fascist struggle. So the leaders like Cunhal and many other communist leaders, they tend to resist to the idea of writing their own private memories. They say, we are not... In the 90s, this is an argument that is used quite a lot. So in Portugal, there still exists a communist party, so it's not a matter of the past. So you don't need to write your own private memory on what you did when you were a communist, because communism is still something that exists. And they would actually establish a difference with other Western communist parties. And this is obviously a matter of strong debate between, for instance, historians and the communist militants and communist leaders. So we historians often complain that they should write their own memories, that is, they should produce sources for us to analyze, and therefore they resist becoming subjects of becoming sources for our own study. And this tension is also a very interesting thing, I guess, to identify, to mention. Okay. What nevertheless occurs in the late 90s, for instance, in the case of Cunhal, he died in 2005, he never wrote his own memories, though he developed a very significant, at least in the number of pages, literary work, where through fictionary accounts, he wrote like 10 or 12 books. The first of those books was written in prison in the 50s, but he wrote those books not under his real name, under a cover name. Only a few years before he died, he revealed that he was the author of the books. And those books, we can obviously read them as a kind of unconfessed personal memory of his own trajectory. But the idea to reject, writing his own memories. This resistance to making himself an individual that whose trajectory deserves or requires a personal testimony is something very, very, very highly affirmed by him and by other communist leaders. So let me just now move to the case of the anti-African, the African colonial movement. And the case I would like to focus on is the case of Amílcar Cabral. So parties like the PAIGC, African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, it was formed in the late 50s, pretty much. That was around the same years where in Angola, in Mozambique, the same kind of parties, Frelimo and MPLA, were formed. They were formed initially by people with different trajectories. Part of the founding members were militant or were were sympathizers of the Communist Party. A significant number of them studied in Portugal, in Lisbon after World War II. They took part in the anti-fascist movement, but they were not Marxist-Leninist parties in the classical Third Internationalist model, according to that model. The case of the PAIGC, the party that was struggling simultaneously for the independence of two countries, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. In that case, the identification with Marxism was actually very diplomatically managed by the leadership of the party. In the other two cases, Mozambique and Angola, that was slightly different. But still, in the case of Cabral, one can find some similarities with the case of Álvaro Cunhal. There is also, at least initially, a resistance to present himself or to perform himself as a kind of an individual that would serve as kind of a flag for the whole movement. But then the international solidarity movement being developed along the different African anti-colonial movements, that is the Pan-African internationality, international movements, but also other kind of solidarity networks, for instance, those connecting French communists, Italian communists, and those movements. Those international networks had a major role in creating Cabral as a kind of an individual, an individual figure that would represent the whole movement. In the case of Cabral, it's very interesting because he publicly always resists to present himself as an author. For instance, one of the first set of documents being published in London in early 60s by Basil Davidson, a close friend and ally of all third worldist movements. They want to publish the book with his name as the author of the book, and he resists until he finally accepts that for the purpose of the efficiency of the Solidarity campaign, his name should be on the front cover. Autobiography in this specific case of Cabral, but I get that this may be also valid for other case studies. Autobiography in this case has to do obviously with written culture, with text, autobiography, but also with image, with the role of visual culture. And this photo, there's an Italian woman here. You can see her. Her name is Bruna Amico, then Bruna Polimeni. She was an Italian, she's still alive actually, photographer that, through the connections with the Italian Communist Party, covered different independence struggles in Africa, but quite intensively the case of Guinea-Bissau. And it's very interesting if you take a look at the archives. She writes to the PAIGC secretariat asking them if she can visit the liberated, so-called liberated areas in Guinea from the mid-60s onwards, and telling them that she therefore could do her own work as a photojournalist or as a photographer, and that work would benefit them in the sense that she would then spread the images, the photos through the Communist Italian Party. She would spread in different media, not only in Italy but across Western countries. And most of the actually photographies we know today of Cabral, the most well-known, were actually done by Bruna Anita. This is one of the Bruna Polimeni. This is one of the photos where she's actually not taking the photo but being photographed. She is very interesting. The case of Bruna Polimeni is very interesting because she tends to refuse to talk about her participation in such. She only gave one interview to a Cape Verdean TV channel like 10 or 11 years ago, and she always argued that I was just there taking photos. Cabral was the one that should be focused. So there is a refusal of any kind of, in her case, of authorship. And although the photography, her photographical work is very impressive, and what is also interesting is that this work is, so this is one of the most famous photos of Cabral. You will find it everywhere, reproduced in many forms until nowadays. And this is the kind of a photo where Bruna Polimeni is. We are not sure if it is Cabral that actually took this photo. But you can see in this kind of photo that these kind of photos are, the camera is always looking at Cabral. So the focus of the camera is on Cabral. You can see this photo being used in many cases. This is one of the first books being published in Portuguese, in this case I guess in Brazil in the 70s. This is the photo is still used last year when the Portuguese Communist Party organized a meeting in homage to Cabral. And obviously the image of Cabral became, very only it's present everywhere in all kind of forms in Cape Verde and in Guinea. This is something different. Is traditional, how do we say in English, not the hat, the gorro. So the design of it just became a few years ago kind of inspiring for kind of high design, haute couture production in Dakar. And you have this image reproduced in many ways. This is one of the first, this is from 72, so this is in the liberated areas. This is one of the first t-shirts there in Portugal before the revolution. You cannot find a t-shirt as a way of political propaganda, but in the liberated areas, after Cabral's assassination, so this is already from, I guess, late 73, you can find this kind of images. So my point here is just that one needs perhaps to, when analyzing autobiographies, or when analyzing the construction of the self, or when considering at least the case of leaderships, like the one of Cabral, the visual aspect is very relevant. This is this famous Tricontinental posters from the Tricontinental Journal. And this is also a Polimeni photo that then inspired a very relevant Portuguese painter to do this kind of pop reinvention of the photo. And this is a more recent Black Lives Matter exhibition in Chicago, where a painter just also presented Cabral. Polimeni's photos are everywhere. This is the first biographical account of Cabral being published in the Soviet Union in '73, and there were a lot of biographical accounts being produced by the African Studies Institute in this period. And there we have also in their archives some of the autobiographical accounts of guerrilla and militants of the PAIGC that were sent to the Soviet Union in order to have military training or to study. What is also very interesting in the case of Cabral is that he initially resists to give his name to the first set of documents, to give his name and his authorship to the first set of collective documents being produced and published in the UK. But in the last 30, 40, 50 years, he became not only an author, but even a kind of scientific author. He's the most, one used to say that he's the former student of the Lisbon University with greater impact factor nowadays, and he's being presented as a kind of bibliographical reference along with people like Fanon and many others. Another source of important, another source of kind of not autobiographical texts, but sometimes autobiographical texts are obituaries. They are not autobiographical, but they often incorporate the autobiographies being written before by the militants. So in the case, for instance, of the Portuguese Communist newspaper, but also in the case of PAIGC, whenever militant died and they had to report his death, part of the obituary recovered the autobiographical account, if that was acceptable. Okay, these are different images, so just to finish. We had to organize, we organized an exhibition recently on Cabral for the commemoration of the Portuguese, for the 50 years of the Portuguese Carnation Revolution. And our attempt was a little bit to, situate him on more collective context. So with the exception of Bruno Polimeni's photos, where the idea was to show the dialogue between Polimeni and Cabral, and to show that Cabral as a figure is the product of his own, obviously, performance, but also of those who were portraying him. We wanted only to show pictures where he was along with many other people. So this is the first known picture of him in late 30s when he was a student in Cape Verde. You will not identify him, he's somewhere over here. When he was playing football in Cape Verde, and this is when he was a student in Lisbon. Finally, these are students. This is in Conakry, and this is in China in '60s also. Finally, this is a picture I wanted also to show to you, just to show how actually this is in Havana in '62, how the construction of the leader and its image is pretty much already a mediatic event created by the international solidarity networks and by the logics of the media, of the mediatic system. This is a press conference in Havana, and this is a photo that was the front cover of Granma, the Cuban newspaper. Finally, these are some of the autobiographies that I have been trying to locate. I've already located a few of them, but I have not been able to analyze them. This is a list that is part of Cabral archives, and is the list of the first militants. There are more pages, like about 75 of them, that were sent in the early 60s to the Soviet Union for military training. And each of them was asked to write a kind of personal note in order to be sent with them to the Soviet Union. Most of them were unable to write, and even within the cadres of the PAIGC, even within the most responsible cadres, most of them were not also able to write. So what is supposed to happen by interviewing one of them, we were able to get this information, is that when they arrived in the Soviet Union, they were interviewed, oral history registration that was made. But that is also something that we wanted to locate. But in that specific case, orality is obviously something that should also be acknowledged beyond the written text dimension of autobiographies. The oral testimony is also a relevant element. In this case, with the particularity that most of them were sent without any kind of experience, not political experience, but party experience. So they were sent directly from the interior areas of Guinea to the Soviet Union without being socialized within the party. And this perhaps produces also some interesting narratives different from the ones that one can find within the leadership. That's it.